Hello, everyone, and welcome to our book conversation today, A Revolution in Rhyme by Professor Fatemeh Shams. I am Behruz Ghamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies. Before I introduce our guest today, I would like to highlight some of the logistics. I will introduce our speaker, and then after 10 to 15 minutes of opening remarks, we'll have a short conversation, and then I will open the floor for your questions. You can submit your questions through the Q&A link at the bottom of your screen. Your microphones would remain on mute, and I would ask you to ask your questions in short sentences rather than long paragraphs. I would also like to thank our events coordinator, Becky Parnian, and our tech support, Pete Nowak, and without their work, this series cannot be realized. I had the pleasure of meeting Professor Shams a few years ago, and since that initial introduction, we have become good friends and good colleagues, and it's my distinct pleasure today to have her here with us, alas virtually, to talk about her book, which just was published a few months ago. Professor Shams is a scholar and a producer of Persian literature. She earned her PhD in Oriental Studies at Oxford University and currently is an assistant professor of Persian literature at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, not far from us here at Princeton. Her work focuses on the intersection of literature, politics, and society. Dr. Shams is interested in the evolution of poetry and patronage in Persian literary tradition and the representation and transformation of this relationship in modern Iran, and has published a remarkable number of articles and book chapters on those topics. Her book, which we'll be discussing today, A Revolution in Rhyme, Poetic Co-option under the Islamic Republic, published by Oxford University Press in 2020, is a prime example of how in her analysis of poetry in post-revolutionary Iran, she weaves together relations of patronage, ideological commitment, stylistic innovations, and social transformation seamlessly and at times counterintuitively in order to illustrate the complexities of literary production and poetic expression in Iran. Dr. Shams is also an internationally acclaimed award-winning poet and has so far published 3 collections of poetry in Persian and English. Her first collection, 88, published in 2012, won the Jale Esfahani Poetry Award in London. Her third bilingual collection, When They Broke Down the Door, published in 2015, was translated by Dick Davis, the translator of Persian poetry into English par excellence, won Latife Yar Shater Book Award in 2016. The upcoming Penguin Anthology of 1,000 Years of Poetry by Persian Women Poets, translated by Dick Davis, features a number of her poems. She is the recipient of the prestigious Humboldt Foundation Fellowship and will spend the next academic year in Berlin to work on her second book project on exile and exilic writings in Persian tradition. So without further ado, the floor is yours. We don't have a floor, we have a screen. The screen is yours, my good friend and colleague, Fatemeh Shams.
Thank you, Behruz Aziz, Professor Qamari, Tabrizi. It's an honor and privilege to being here, and in particular to be in conversation with you. I was thinking last night, I was actually reflecting on the past, and I noticed that it was 2 springs ago that I came to Princeton to present parts of this book that was in the making at the time. And it was a bright, beautiful spring day, cherry blossoms were in bloom. And you know, I felt a little nostalgic. So it's great to be back virtually. And I would like to thank your colleagues, Becky Parnian and Mr. Noak, for making this event possible. I know how difficult and hectic these webinars and these days are, especially for those who are taking care of the administrative and technical aspects of this event. And to you for making this time and this space to give me an opportunity to discuss my book with one of the most inspiring historians of the Iranian Revolution. It's a real honor to be here. So thank you. And I would like to say hi to everyone who is participating. I appreciate your time to be here. And without further ado, I would like to spend more time on the conversation. So I hopefully will keep my introduction to the book and why I wrote this book and what the book is about brief to have more time to be in conversation with Behruz and also to be in conversation, hopefully, with the participants through questions and answers. So I will put my alarm on, so I won't go over time. I'm going to share my screen as everybody does these days to have some kind of visual connection with you guys. So this book, as Behruz mentioned, and thank you for that generous introduction, Behruz. As you mentioned, this book is a book about the role that poetry plays in policy, power, and political legitimacy in modern Iran, with a specific focus on the post-revolutionary period and the rule of the Islamic Republic. I would like to say a couple of words about the book itself and why I wrote this book. This book really grew out of both my personal experience as a post-revolutionary generation, born and growing up under the Islamic Republic, particularly during Iran-Iraq War and the post-war era, and also my academic life in the United Kingdom and the United States. I have included the chapters of the book, the table of contents here. I think it's useful to just have an idea about how this book is structured. The book consists of 7 chapters. As you can see, it starts with an introduction on the role that poetry and power plays. It is the focus is modern Iran, but really I go back in time in order to find parallels and continuities in the tradition, and then I use that as a framework in order to reflect on the present. So the analytical framework of this book is both chronological and thematic. And what do I mean by that is, as Behruz also mentioned, I'm interested in the relationship between patronage and poets, both in the medieval period and the way in which this pattern has evolved over time. And the relationship between the poetry and the state and poetry and politics in the modern context. As the years that I grew up under the Islamic Republic and I was educated there, as a student and then also as a college student, one thing that constantly was interesting to me was that why poetry matters so much, not just to the Iranian people, but also to the administration, in particular to the current leader of the Islamic Republic, and how could we understand this interest and this fascination with poetry and the way in which poetry has been co-opted, manipulated, used, disseminated, and appropriated over time. Um, and in order to understand this relationship, which was at times very sort of difficult to understand, and the reason for that was um, sort of these polarized ideas and sort of binary approaches to the particular poetic trend that was believed to have emerged as in the aftermath of the revolution. The first exposure to this poetic trend was through the school textbooks, of course, that Adabiyat Enqilab Islami, or the literature of the Islamic Revolution, according to these school textbooks, was defined as as a body of literature that included poems, writings that have been produced since the victory of the revolution. The themes of such work included Islamic culture, Imam Hussein's revolt, Khomeini's thoughts, and the cultural and spiritual qualities of the revolutionary society. So this was one side of this official narrative, and the way in which this particular poetic trend was depicted. On the other hand, years later, when I decided to pursue higher education outside Iran, and the way in which this particular poetic trend and its relationship with politics and with the state was captured was quite the opposite, but with a very interesting similarity. In both narratives, um, the the emergence and the roots of this phenomenon, this trend, um, was defined by the emergence and the rise of the revolution itself. There was something about this definition, or these two approaches, these binary approaches to this phenomenon. And the reason I call it binary is because in the second approach, usually these writers, because of this connection that they had with the state, were defined and viewed as the so-called Islamist poets. There was a direct link made between their religious views that they held, and the political views that they held, and the kind of literature poetry that they produced. Um, in this book, I try to challenge these binary approaches with the specific focus on this particular literary trend. And how do I do that? First of all, one of the premises of the book is that to show that literature does not begin and end with revolution. And this is a tendency that we see among the scholars of Persian literature, that there is this tendency towards an episodic approach to the literary history. That okay, literature was going, it was going its way, it was happening, it was being produced, and then the revolution happens. It reminds me of the conversations these days that everybody were living their lives and we're supposed to do this, and then suddenly pandemic happened. There is this rupture that's kind of the sense that literature was having a particular type of life, and then the revolution happened, and then everything changed, and as a result of this rupture. Well, there were continuities as well, and sure, there were ruptures, but there were also continuities. There was evolution, there was change, there was transformation. And as a result of this idea that literature does not begin and end with the revolution, I also argue that literary trends do not emerge in a vacuum and without influencing and being influenced by the existing and competing trends of the past and present. This might sound like a very obvious statement, and it is obvious, but when we look in reality in what the scholarship have produced, in fact, this very obvious point have been completely overlooked. The approach in the arguments usually is that if there is a particular poetic um, trend with particular members, for example, let's say Kanun Navistandegان Iran, the Association of Iran's Writers, they have nothing to do with other competing trends. For example, the trend that was sponsored by the state, known as the state-sponsored poets or Islamic Republican poets, as they call them in this work. Or with the trends that came before the revolution, for example, the guerrilla poetry of the 1970s. And I tried to challenge this approach and to show that, in fact, there are very meaningful and interesting dialogues, similarities, parallels between these different trends. We might not be able to see them on surface. In fact, as a result of the revolution and politicization of the public sphere, and creating so many binaries after the revolution, it's very difficult to see these dialogues that, yes, happen in the form of imitation, sometimes appropriation, manipulation, and co-optation. But all these are different types and forms of dialogue that literary dialogues that could be investigated. And that has been one of my hopes, at least in the book, to decode some of these similarities. And this is of course, the close past, as I would call it, and then there is a remote past. There is a distant past with which this trend is in conversation. The way in which, for example, the mystical tropes have been used and appropriated in the Iran-Iraq war poetry is one of the topics that I discuss in one of the chapters of the book. And then this very important last point here, that literary trends are, of course, by default dynamic and constantly change in the course of time. They're not stagnant, not ideologically, not aesthetically. They keep changing and keep evolving. And the state-sponsored literary trend is no exception. And in that sense, it is, in fact, indeed, a non-episodic evolving trend that has been grossly overlooked, particularly for its ideologically charged content. So in order to basically meet up these premises in the book, I go back in time. I go back to the pre-revolutionary period, both to the medieval period and also to in the 1960s and 1970s, when Khomeini went to exile. And as a result of that, there were protests, and then the rise of the revolutionary movement gradually after, in his absence, during the 1960s and 70s. And I start the book and end the book with two qasidas by two poets who in surface might not actually have to do anything with each other, ideologically speaking, which is a very sort of fashionable way of categorizing and labeling poets when it comes to the modern period, based on their ideological commitments and tendencies. Well, if you actually look at their works and the content of their works and the forms and the aesthetics of their works, we'll see that we'll find a lot of similarities. Mirzazadeh ya Nemat Azarm, as you know, Azarm is his pen name, and Amiri Esfandaqeh, they belong to two different generations of poets. One of them ended up in exile in France to this day as a result of his political views and writings. And Amiri Esfandaqeh is, in fact, one of the poets of the current, very close to the current leader of the Islamic Republic, and he make regular appearances in his poetry nights, annual poetry nights. These are the two parts of the two long qasidas by these poets, the one written by Azam in 1964 and the one written by Amiri Esfandaqeh in 2009. One addresses Khomeini and the other one addresses Iran. And the Iran here, of course, I contextualize this poem in the final chapter of the book, that how Iran is partly the seat of the power, the current administration in power, the leader of the Islamic Republic, but also an idea, a sort of an imagined community. That and the evolution of this poet-patron relationship that we see very clearly in Azam's Qasideh in 1964, following the footprints of the poets, of the court poets of the medieval period, the way in which they actually address their patrons, using the form of the ancient form of Qasideh, and the way he uses religion and Islam in order to address and sort of praise the exiled cleric. They all complicate also our understanding of the way in which religion is, the position of religion vis-a-vis poetry. And the fact that there is this assumption that always when there was a talk about Islam and then there was a talk about religion, it was only a particular group of poets who identified as practicing Muslims who actually went for these kind of concepts and sort of religious sentiments and ideas. Well, we're looking at Azam's poetry. He's he has leftist tendencies, a member of Iran's Writers Association. Here we are seeing this poem using over and over again very Shiite sentiments and very religious sort of themes in order to exemplify Khomeini as the descendant of the Prophet and the Shia Imams. And then we have a much more, in fact, if we look at look at Amiri Esfandagh's poetry, Qasideh, we see that the tone has changed, the concerns has changed. In fact, the way in which people are framed in these two Qasidehs are very different from each other. And also the claim that sort of the last line of this poem, I think, is very interesting, that the people who went to vote, they weren't to replace God. And I'm out of time. They weren't to replace God, or they weren't to actually claim prophecy, which is an interesting, again, approach, I think, to religion and the way that it interacts with politics. So looking at poems, I think, and that's what I try to do in the book, by looking at the poems rather than the context, to see what this poetry actually suggests, and how could we understand revolution and what happened in the aftermath of the revolution if we look at the poems. I'll try to be very quick. I have 2 more slides to share. I hope that's okay. These are the poets that I introduce in the book. There are 10 poets of 2 different generations to show how this trend actually was not just tied to the revolution itself. In fact, it started years and decades before the revolution, especially if you look at the poetic legitimacy and the way in which religion, poetry and religion actually constantly interacted with one another since the advent of Islam to this day, and how this didactical sort of tradition evolves over time, and how these poets use and benefit from this different trends through imitation and appropriation and co-optation in order to create their own discourse. And also, having said all of this, also considering the fact that they had their poetic individuality and subjectivity. Yes, it was filled with ambivalences and doubts and questions, and each of them had their own journey. I tried to show it in the book as well, how these poets were different from each other. And the way that, by focusing on poetry as a space to both disseminate and denounce ideology, especially when, for example, they write about the war and writing in the post-war period, we see that the tensions and the ambivalences and the disillusionments make the paths that these poets take quite different from one another. So yes, there is definitely a very close and intimate relationship between the state and literary production as far as these poets and this poetic trend is concerned. But that said, it doesn't mean that state has the full power and an influence to constantly regulate and engineer what they produce. In fact, if we look at the poetry of different periods and the evolution of these poets, and this is the last part of my presentation, is that we see that regardless of their relationship with the state, we see that the voices of these poets change over time. This is an example of the two poems, one in 1979 and one in 1987 by Tahireh Safarzadeh. At the beginning, and this is not the first poem is written prior to the Iran-Iraq war, and she still sees herself in a battle. You can see that the collective we exists in both poems. The first one is very much resonant with what the Azam's discourse of religion and the way the Shiism is used as part of the political resistance, discourse of political resistance. Whereas in the second one, she is very, very honestly and frankly reflects on the war and the way that the war is basically affecting her writing. These are parts of longer poems. And I think, just looking at these different poems, we see that the voices change regardless of these close ties with the state. And on that note, I think I will stop because I went beyond time, and I'll just I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shahzad. This was wonderful, and it's a pity that we don't have time
Yeah,
to
sorry.
read some of these poems in Persian and then in translation, because really the core of what you argue is hard to communicate without having access to the Persian text. But still, I mean, I think the book stands on its own, and its significance to me is that it opens up the possibility of scrutiny of a genre that remained unscrutinized for such a long time. And exactly the way you described in the book, um, the reason for that was that it was all set aside because of its ideological commitment and understood as a genre that is at the service of the ruling state and the patronage of the state, and without thinking that within that genre there are all these different kinds of approaches to literature, to poetry, to classical poetry, to Nemaic poetry, in modern poetry, meters, rhymes, and all these different ways that one can engage with poetry. And I'm really grateful to you that you basically opened up this door to say, hey, there is something there worth um, looking at and analyzing, and that within itself, like off the bat, I think this is such an important part of your contribution to the field.
Thank you.
The other thing that I really liked in the book is the way you go back and forth between the construction of this new genre after the revolution, and the way the state tries to generate a hegemonic position through literature and poetry, and in conversation with the Soviet social realism, and I like that parallel, and it gives a different way of understanding what is going on in Iran outside these kind of common tropes of fundamentalism, Islamic this, Islamic that. But you realize that no, this is actually a move for construction of hegemonic position that is not unprecedented. Of course, you look at the distinctions of this moment, and then at the same time, you look at the connection that this moment has with other post-revolutionary experiences. When I was reading your first your manuscript and then now your book, it reminded me of this amazing moment in the Constitutional Assembly after the revolution. This is a few months, the summer after the revolution, that there's a whole group of mostly clerics sitting there trying to write the Constitution, and one of these grand ayatollahs says one day that, we are men of religion. We don't know how to write constitution. This is not our job. And Ayatollah Beheshti, who was the vice chair of the Constitutional Assembly, says that the reason you ask this question, you raise that point, is that you don't do your homework. We gave you the constitution of Bulgaria and China and the Soviet Union to read, and we just ask you to change wherever you see Marxism with Islam, and then we have an Islamic constitution. And
Wow.
I thought that was so brilliant, like. And,
Yeah, I wish I knew that earlier to include it in the book. That's just so apt and
but
spot on.
this is really, I that's why I said that, when I was reading your book, it just constantly took me back to that moment, that these are not unprecedented moments. These are moments that have been articulated in so many different ways, in so many different contexts. And there is some level of continuity. Iran also had its own ideologues. Iran had its own Andrei Zhdanov. Iran had its own social realism, and again, Iran, as you show in the book, had within its own production of this cultural ideological hegemony dissenting voices. It has within its own production had different kinds of stylistic interventions, and these are the and particularly after the war. I mean, I like when you talk about the second generation, which is basically a post-war generation, um, that how they are rethinking all those points of references. When you talk about nostalgia, for example, now the Islamic Republic has its own point of nostalgia about war. It has its
Mhm.
own point of nostalgia about revolutionary ethos. And
Exactly.
these become, and that's really a brilliant moment, that it sort of um, moves from living in the moment of revolution, living in the moment of war, to the moment that those instances become point of nostalgic reference, that shows in the poetry, and of course it shows in Iranian cinema, it shows in Iranian music, it shows everywhere, and um, and I think that's really the major contribution of the book, the way I see it. I mean, you might feel like, okay, no, I don't want to put the emphasis there, but I think that that kind of shift and that kind of opening to allow a certain kind of engagement that is, for the most part, absent in the scholarly work, is the major point of major contribution, intervention of the book. But I wanted to share also a very quick clip to drive that point home that what exactly does it mean when we say that, okay, the the genre stays the same, but there are stylistic interventions that transforms the genre at the end. And I wanted to share this, and I'm sure if there are Iranians in our audience who are old enough like me to remember the time of revolution would remember, and you mentioned this the revolutionary song Khomeini Imam, which was
Mhm.
Kazem Kazemi's poem, right? That was Kazem Kazemi.
No, Khomeini Imam is Hamid Sabzavari's poem,
And it's
actually.
as well. Okay.
Yeah.
So, but I thought that that song is quite interesting. I wanted to play that song and then later reappropriation of that song because the message is the same, but the style is so different,
It's
you know.
different. Yeah. The
And
first time it was sang in the
at the
airport.
airport, at the airport.
Yes.
And I think this is sort of an interesting moment that I'm going to share my screen for a second. That Khomeini enters the airport, and this is a person that chances are had never listened to music, you know, and suddenly he faces this group of students, all men, singing in unison this revolutionary song. And let me share my screen for a second here. And okay, this is, um, why can't I see that here? Um, I can't share my screen. What is this?
No, if you go on share a screen,
Okay, all right.
there it is.
Okay, there it is. So, so this is the first song, the first instance that Khomeini sees this song at the airport, and you can see that he, of course, he's shocked and
که از همراهان ایشون هم بودند. گرامی باد خمینی ای امام. خمینی ای امام، 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 خمینی ای امام. ای مجاهد، ای مظهر شرف، ای گذشته ز جان در ره هدف. چون نجات انسان شعار توست، مرگ در راه حق افتخار توست. این تویی پاسدار حق، خصم اهریمنان دوستدار حق. بود شعار تو به راه حقیان، ز ما تو را درود، ز ما تو را سلام. خمینی ای امام، خمینی ای امام، خمینی ای امام، خمینی ای امام.
so this is the first version. I wanted you to see all the sort of young men and students, and then this is the second version. Some years later.
Yeah.
And
Symphony. It's a
and I
symphony.
want this is like Tehran Symphony Orchestra, and this introduction is so interesting because all these instruments come in, and it sounds like a symphonic poem, and then and the 4-line chorus of men and women, you know, and it's such a fascinating kind of transition. Listen to the long introduction. So, I think
Fascinating.
this is really what captures to me, what you argue in the book, it doesn't take it away from the ideological commitment. It doesn't, it's still there, but nevertheless, a totally different kind of phenomena stylistically. And you see that it's that I in the book, in different poems, from qaside to to different forms of modern poetry, and doing away with meters and rhymes and then going back to them, and so on and so forth. So really not a question, but I wanted to sort of open up the
Mhm.
conversation with those lines that is a call for a closer investigation of what goes on after the revolution in Iran in terms of production of cultural ethos and values and mores, and how they try to sustain it. Anyway, I stop here because I wasn't planning to talk that much, but I got too
I mean,
carried away with the videos.
no, I just wanted to say thank you so much for, first of all, for just putting everything into perspective by showing these two videos, which I'm really grateful you did that. It helped, it sort of helped the audience to know also what I'm doing in the book. But I also wanted to add that I discussed this particular poem in length, actually, in the not introduction, the second chapter of the book, when I'm talking about the canons. And one of the things that I mentioned there in regards to this poem and other similar poems that Hamid Sabzavari, one of the leading figures of this trend, wrote, and many, in fact, have memorized these poems without even knowing who wrote them, which, and regardless of what ideological tendencies and beliefs, I mean, many of these poems and songs that mostly were put into songs were written by the poets of this trend, particularly the pre-revolutionary generation. And one thing that, with regards to the videos that you shared, I think is important, and I also try to show that in the book, which challenges implicitly this sort of binary approach to state vis-a-vis literature, or state vis-a-vis society, state vis-a-vis literary production, is that when we talk about state-sponsored literature, there is this misconception that, okay, so this means that if there was no state, there was no such thing as a state-sponsored literature. And this trend has its livelihood and benefits and existence all thanks to the state. Well, as you just showed us in these two videos, there's no such thing as this kind of cause and effect relationship. These young boys and men who were singing that song, they were not receiving any patronage from, there was no Islamic republic at this point in power to pay them or to sponsor them, meaning that this was very much a grassroots phenomenon, part of the revolutionary movement, not orchestrated and in sort of structured the way we see in the second video. That then, yes, at that point it becomes a culture industry of the government, and it becomes, a sort of a cultural product of a system that now has consolidated itself and know exactly what it wants, know exactly what this song should look like. Not only should be heard, but it should also how it should look like. There has to be a harmonious balance of gender, of musical instruments that we don't hear in the first song. And as you rightly mentioned, there is a transition, there is an evolution. The poem remains the same, which is fascinating. The text, the only thing that remains the same is the text and, of course, the melody, but everything else changes. And understanding this transition, I think, is important if we are keen to have an in-depth and nuanced understanding of the revolution and its aftermath. We can't just focus on one one dimension, being the marginalized, being the censored, and then sort of make ourselves convinced, convince ourselves that we know everything, all different layers of the Iranian society. And I think this trend in particular, and their very complicated relationship, not just with power, but also with the tradition, shows many different dimensions of this relationship with literature and politics.
Yes. We have a question on I mean, in the book, you really nicely lay out how different styles of modern poetry, Nimaic poetry, and old come together and move away from one another. We have a question here that where is the place of the classical forms like Qaside, Ghazal in that kind of literary production in after the revolution?
Yeah, so as I mentioned also in my very brief introduction to the book, it's quite fascinating to see how the oldest forms such as Qaside and Ghazal and Masnavi play into this relationship between these poets with the tradition and also with the politics and revolution. As I mentioned, I start and end the book with two Qasidas, although in terms of, as I mentioned, the generational sort of dimensions of it, like the two poets who wrote these two Qasidas belong to two different generations, two different ideological backgrounds. But what I'm interested in is the poem itself and the Qasida itself, and how this the elasticity and flexibility of this form makes it still very much relevant to today's Iranian politics and society. So if I want to talk about the role of classical poetic forms, in the sense that if you're talking about the role of the tradition, we can't really understand this particular trend without having a very thorough understanding of the so-called classical tradition or the pre-modern or the medieval poetic tradition. And the reason for that, and that's precisely one of the points that I mentioned in the introduction, that usually there is one of the judgments and evaluations that is pretty common actually among the critics as far as these poets are concerned, is that these poets they know nothing about Persian literature, and that their poetry is not poetry. Well, that's not the case. In fact, if you go and look at their work, you see that they have a very in-depth understanding of the form, of the aesthetics. You might not agree with their aesthetics of their work, but it doesn't mean that they don't have any knowledge of the tradition. In fact, many of them, such as Sabzavari himself, or Ali Muallem, or even Qaisar Haminpour, like the younger generations, they have mastered all these classical forms, and they use them in, for example, you also have certain forms such as the quatrain or the rubai, that we have a revival of this particular poetic form in the wake of war. I discuss in the book that what is the role of, why there is this return to quatrain during a period when conveying the message is the most important, and sort of having that poetic effect is more important than any other moment, and how these quatrains are made into songs and made into slogans. So classical poetic forms go hand in hand with their relevance in this period. And then we also see that in the post-war period, after Khomeini's death, we have a return to elegy or eulogy during the war. So all these different forms, when we see these continuities, I think one of the most important arguments of the book is that focusing on the form and showing how the form is evolving and changing in the modern period allows us to understand this trend as part and parcel of the same tradition. We can't just separate them and say because we disagree with their position, they're not part of the tradition. They have to be littered out of the tradition, and we're not going to talk about them. I sincerely think that we need to revise and sort of, review our position in order to have a better understanding of modern Iranian literature, really, and the tradition.
On that note, there is also a question about what kind of attempts are being made to reframe the canon of modern classics of Persian poetry, like Akhavan, Nima, Furugh, Shamlu. I see in the past couple of years, at least from afar, I see a very interesting transformation inside the country, that you have conversations in newspapers about Shamlu, often in conversation about Furugh, but how in general has there been a strategy to reframe the canon of modern classical poetry after the revolution, and how does it work?
Right. So you mean from this on the side of the state? I mean, the ruling power. I would say yes. There have been multiple attempts, not only a single attempt to do that. But in the book, I don't get into this politics of canonization as far as the whole tradition is concerned, because that will just take up a whole book to actually write just about how the whole canon and tradition itself has been reformulated after the revolution. But I just give you an example. Like after the revolution, Hafiz was one of the poets who, of course, had to be reevaluated and revisited. There was, there was an edition of Hafiz already available, and revised and edited by Ahmad Shamlu. And very soon, like in the very early days, in fact, after the revolution, we see that Murtaza Mutahhari's Tamashagah Raz is published, which is a direct response and reaction to Ahmad Shamlu's edition of Hafiz. In the introduction of the book, Murtaza Mutahhari makes this very clear, that any type of sort of interpretation of Hafiz's wine poetry as taking it as literal is complete misunderstanding and misconception of his poetic output. And then this is only one single attempt out of many others, and many other festivals and seminars that have been taking place after the revolution in revisiting Hafiz and understanding his relationship, in particular with drunkenness and wine. We have annual poetry ceremonies that I discuss in length in the last chapter of the book, where Khamenei makes sure to go back and revisit the tradition every time by addressing a particular poet. He had many times referenced Hafiz and how his poetry, how his wine poetry should be metaphorized and understood as part of the mystical tradition. And then we have a tendency, especially after the official poetry nights by Khamenei have been established as an annual televised event. For example, canonizing Sahib Tabrizi has been a very interesting aspect, I think, of these nights, that he has a very special sort of interest in Sahib Tabrizi, and in many different occasions he has advised the young poets to go and read and try to imitate and endorse the ethics of Sahib's poetics. And then, and that's of course, the classical part of the tradition. Then there is also a tendency towards canonizing or decanonizing certain modern poets. Forough Farrokhzad has been on multiple occasions. In fact, Khamenei made it clear that she must be sort of wiped out, not as literal as this, but be sort of cancelled as a role model for women poets. The replacement for her has been Parveen Tasami. These kind of binaries that again are constantly in the making. That if you read Parveen Tasami, if you are looking for a role model, look into Parveen Tasami and don't look into Forough Farrokhzad. A dichotomy that really doesn't make sense if you look into their poetics. There is so much that they share.
I think the last interview I read of Khamenei, he was a little bit kinder and gentler towards Forough Farrokhzad.
Yes. She was saved at the end, and she was that Aqabat Bekhair showed because she was reading, and it was an interesting actually take, because he said that she had been saved at the end of her life because of her intimate and close relationship with Molavi's poetry, because she was reading Molavi, which is another intertextual sort of interpretation of why a poet is saved or not.
I want to ask you one last question about because you refer to literary traditions and the way they're used or co-opted and appropriated, and because I know that you spend like half a chapter talking about the notion of tradition, and so the question is, how are you conceptualizing the notion of tradition here? And when you say that like literary traditions, what are we exactly referring to, and whether these traditions are in constant transformative mode or not?
Yeah, I mean, by tradition, I mean, the word that I have in mind, of course, in Persian is sunnat adabi, and the sunnat adabi, of course, has a history, and the history for me, of course, doesn't start at the 10th century, although that's the way that the literary tradition has been sort of historicized, if you like. And I try in the book to show that Persian tradition doesn't, in fact, only include Persian tradition because of the relationship that, in fact, because of this relationship between the poetry and patronage that goes back, as I mentioned in the introduction of the book, goes back to the pre-Islamic period, when the role of the poet minstrel in the court is very important. And we have, although we don't have much available to us in terms of the historical documents, but based on the documentations that scholars such as Julius Scott Maysami and Mary Boyce presented to us, we know that there was a relationship, close relationship, in fact, between the poets and the court, although the poets were mostly improvising and they were singing and sort of writing at the time. And then this sort of close, intimate relationship changes over time with the advent of Islam and with the Arab conquest in Iran, and the role of the poet in the court. We see that although the pattern continues, there is also a very conscious effort in adapting and also endorsing the Arabic tradition, which, again, that's the reason why Qasideh is so important to me, and I think in the tradition as well. And one of the things that in this definition of this tradition is important to me is the place, the position of religion, and by that I mean Islam. Again, I discuss in the book, and I think this is something that has never been actually discussed, is that when we are talking about Qasideh and poetic legitimacy, especially in the Persian tradition, like Arabic tradition, we have to go back to the roots. We have to go back to the poetics of supplication. We have to go back to the very first examples of the qasidas that were written in praise of Muhammad after his prophecy, for the sake of legitimacy and in order to be rescued. And many of the poets who actually went to Muhammad with their praise poems, known as mantle odes, that has been discussed by Susan Stetkevich. I use that in the analytical framework of the book, that how this poetic form actually was used, and poetry itself as a space to save the poet. And to legitimize the rule of the new prophet, right? So by tradition, I mean all of this, not only the poetic forms, not only qasida and ghazal as it has been used by various poets of the medieval period, and the way, of course, that also is part of the definition, but not the only one. And then with regards to the second, and thank you for this very important question, I really appreciate that you brought this up, the use and the co-optation and the appropriation, which of course has to do with the conceptualization of the tradition, is that basically the reason, and I think that the reason that is, and it's a very important concept to understand why I chose this co-optation as the concept. And what do I mean by that is to show these continuities and parallels that have been manifested in the works of these poets, and the way in which they take over this tradition through acts of imitation, appropriation, and co-optation for a newly defined purpose. And that newly defined purpose is what makes the co-optation basically. So to give you one example, and then I just stop there, I know that I talked a lot, is that, for example, when we look at the poems of the war period, and I have a chapter on the war period where I talk about the co-optation of mystical tropes, you see that on the surface, when you read many of these poems, you see a whirling dervish soaked in his own blood, or drunk by blood, or whirling in the light. And if you are familiar with the tradition, you can see these key concepts kind of popping up. That's basically taking over the tradition. But they are used for a completely different purpose. They are used in order to conceptualize martyrdom. And of course, martyrdom as part of the Shi'i tradition is something that existed. It's nothing new, but to use what existed in the tradition, religious and literary, in order to make that moment meaningful, that moment relevant in the history, and to use poetry in order to make that moment relevant. That's what I mean by co-optation, and I hope that my answer was clear enough.
Thank you so much, and with big apologies to all the members of the audience whose questions we couldn't address. This is again a beautiful book, Revolution in Rhyme, and thank you again so much, Shahzad.
Thank you for this opportunity. This was such a pleasure.
Hopefully you have a productive year in Berlin, and after you come back from Berlin, we want you to come down to Princeton and tell us how Berlin was and where the state of the second book is.
Would love that. And I really look forward to our future conversations. And I can't thank you enough, Behruz, for this very enlightening conversation. It's always a pleasure. I always learn so much in your company, and I can't thank you enough for that. And thank you for these wonderful questions from the audience. It always is a pleasure to see an engaged audience with the discussion. So thank you.
Thank you so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.